This Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Holness, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Malahoo-Ford, Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Green, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mr. Heroy Clark, Dr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Mrs. Williams, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Mr. Main, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terry Long, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Baz, Mr. Wright, Mr. Hutchinson,
Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following: annual reports and audited financial statements of the National Solid Waste Management Authority for the years 2006-07 up to the year 2014-2015.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker,
Minister.
be it resolved most despicable person to walk towards a member of this House. So please keep quiet. Mr. Speaker, the member pretty well knows exactly where we are. The issue, he had discussion with the Prime Minister on the issue, and the Prime Minister assured that there will be discussions. Yes, there will be discussions. But as far as the chairmanship is concerned, no, member from Westmoreland Eastern, I do not have to. If you read the Constitution 75(3), tells you exactly how chairmen of committees are elected. So don't tell me that I have to name the chairman. Standing orders 75(3) tells us clearly how chairmen are elected. So don't tell me I have to name chairman. Mr. Speaker, based on agreement and understanding, as it relates to oversight and accountability committees, those will be chaired by the opposition. Things like the public accounts and the PAAC will be chaired by them, by the opposition, without question. Look, man. Why don't you go and read your standing order? Standing order 75(3) tells us. And Mr. Speaker,
Minister, will you address the Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, may I try my best to educate those members who are incapable of reading and understanding standing order. I said then, in strict accordance with standing order 75(3), I named the committees. I said in strict accordance. But obviously, he is ignorant to what 75(3) says. Okay?
So just to be quite clear, so that we're clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to go through the committees that are to be chaired, that are chaired by the opposition. You have the Internal and External Affairs, you have the Public Accounts, and the Public Administration and Appropriations, which is the one that we are dealing with now. Infrastructure Committee, the Economy and Production Committee, Human Resources Committee. Those are all chaired by the opposition.
I just said a while ago that in strict accordance with 75(3), I named the committee on that basis, the committees. I said where the oversight and accountability committees, and you have two of those, Public Accounts and PAAC. Right? I said Public Accounts and PAAC, those are the Accountability and Oversight Committee, with chaired by the opposition, to provide the necessary oversight. And I believe the rest, we'll have discussion. I just said that. The PM said that to him. They have that discussion. So just leave this now. We're dealing with the PAAC today.
Mr. Speaker, I really want our position to be absolutely clear. Right. Yes. So the PAAC, right. Mr. Speaker, just a brief reminder. These committees were established under the new arrangement under Prime Minister Golding, and it was accepted that it's more appropriate because all of them do provide oversight, all of them, not just the PAC or the public accounts, and that it was appropriate for the opposition to chair these committees. The position was adopted by the Simpson-Miller administration. We continued it, and it now appears that that convention is like the government is likely to retreat from it, and that is, Mr. Speaker, that is what we view with reprehension. We will not accede to that, and I want it to be quite clear on our part. It's going to come back again because this is the first of a number of committees to be appointed, right? And we just want to be quite clear, Acting House Leader. Is it that the government intends to change this format in relation to all of those committees that I have just listed?
There will be discussion, and as far as I'm concerned, I already made it clear that when it comes to the Oversight and Accountabilities Committee, you'll chair those. But as far as I'm concerned, there'll be discussion, and I made it quite clear his position is noted. I noted his position before, and I do note it again. Your position is noted.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to make the point that the Parliament does involve the rules and the standing orders, but over time, conventions have developed. The first adjustment that was made was the establishment during, I believe, Prime Minister Pattison's tenure. The first adjustment that was made during Prime Minister Pattison's tenure was the formation of the sessional select committees. Subsequent to that, during the tenure of Prime Minister Bruce Golding, the proposal was made by him that the committees would be chaired by a member of the opposition, and that was implemented during his tenure. That continued during the tenure of Prime Minister Simpson Miller, and has continued up to now during the tenure of Prime Minister Holness. For it to be changed arbitrarily, without notice, without any prior consideration, and I dare say contrary to best practice in the most up-to-date parliaments, does not seem to give us a view that any of the other discussions that we are being asked to participate in are going to be meaningful in terms of trying to create an atmosphere of collaboration and appropriate oversight. We have no idea why the government is reconsidering this tradition that has developed. In fact, I would expect, in keeping with the tone that is being suggested, is that what would happen is that rather than reverting to the past, he would move amendments to the standing orders that we could both consider. Mr. Speaker, it's an unhealthy state of affairs.
I was advised that the resolution that was placed on the floor was withdrawn, and that discussions was about to take place concerning this matter. If those discussions have not yet taken place, I would ask Dr. Phillips and I would ask the leader of opposition business to have some discussion on the matter outside of having it as we are doing it now, because that was the understanding that discussions would take place on this matter. I'm going to therefore ask the leader of government business to have discussions on this matter, and that we can be advised in the very near future, so that we don't have this thing dragging on and on. Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the recommittal of announcement.
Minister Warmington, 1 minute. I understand that.
Mr. Speaker, On behalf of the Minister of Finance and the Public Service.
Minister Williams.
What?
Could you wait a minute?
Mr. Speaker, I ask the recommittal of notices of motion given, announcements.
We have been asked to go back to announcement. Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today. Also laid on the table of the House today is the Jamaica Second Supplementary Estimates for 2017-2018.
Members, I wish to announce that we have some visitors here today that I'm going to request the Parliament to recognize. Former Member of Parliament and Minister, Dr. Davis. We also have two members of the upper house, two senators. And of course, a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr. Paul Martin. Looking in the gallery, sitting very quietly like students and other visitors, I wish you to recognize students and teachers from the St. Elizabeth Technical High School. I have been further advised that we are being privileged to have with us somewhere in the gallery a former senator, Hugh Hart. We want to welcome you all here and hope you have a wonderful time listening to the debate today. Notices of motion given orally. Mrs. Williams, we are now asking you to give your
Mr. Speaker.
Minister Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move the following motion. Be it resolved that the second supplementary estimates of expenditure for the financial year ending March 31, 2018, which was laid on the table of the House on the 13th day of March 2018, be referred to the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives for consideration and report. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I'll move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Questions and answers to questions.
Report, notices of motion given orally. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will seek leave to introduce, and I've read a first time, a bill entitled the Banking Services Amendment Act 2018.
Sorry, you're supposed to get an answer for your thing. Supposed to get an answer? Do another answer? Okay. Mr. Speaker, you'll recall last week there were some outstanding questions from the Standing Finance Committee meeting, and the acting House Leader had promised to respond. I know I had asked some questions also in relation to the Minister of Mining that we have not yet received responses to.
Mr. Speaker, it's the same thing.
1 minute, Mr. Speaker. 1 minute. 1 minute.
It's about the same thing.
1 minute, please. And Mr. Warmington, at our last meeting, I was permitted to advise the House that questions placed on the table would get priority according to the orders in the standing order. And the Leader of Opposition Business is now questioning, and I'm sure that the member from Central Kingston will remind me of what was said to me that I said to them.
Mr. Speaker, I'm told that those questions will be all ready tomorrow.
Are you saying that questions will be answered tomorrow? Questions will be answered tomorrow?
That's what I just said, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, Mr. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice.
You forgot me, sir? No, I merely wanted to add that there were a number of questions during the Standing Finance Committee to the Minister of Education, where he promised that the answers would be forthcoming. So when the inventory is being made, I'm requesting that those be attended to also.
Government business, I will be advised Okay, Mr. Tree. I understand that Minister Mackenzie has a statement, a motion. It's requiring that there be, no, just a minute. We have to move that we suspend the standing orders to return to that item. Mr. Warmington. Minister, I understand that your statement will be relevant tomorrow at the sitting. Motion that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motion relating to the sitting of the House. Motion for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister Warmington.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing order to enable me to take the motion notes of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, the Oversight and Accountability Committees will be chaired by the opposition. The Prime Minister offered to have discussion with the leader of the opposition business, which is well aware, to resolve any outstanding issue or understand. His position is taken and noted and noticing of it. So the committee, Mr. Dr. McNeil, who chaired the last committee, is designated to chair this committee. So, Mr. Speaker, I put the motion to the House before you.
Mr. Speaker, we of course support the motion. In relation to the other committees, we have had discussions with the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister, and we have certain assurances that we will rely on going forward in terms of the timeliness of the appointment of the new committees. And our position, as he is quite aware, is that we maintain the chairmanship as they are. So with that, Mr. Speaker, we support the motion put forward by the acting leader of government business.
Mr. Warmington, there's a motion on the floor. Those
the Minister of Finance. Of the House. He also founded the Road Safety Council. Mr. Speaker, my mother, Lady Patricia Golding, has also led a life of public service. First in the Central Planning Unit, when she started as a cadet in the early 1950s, an administrative cadet, and then at the Mona Rehab Center as a volunteer in support of my father's important work. God bless you, Mummy. Mr. Speaker, my 3 children, all adults now, have been supportive of all that I do and provide a welcome respite from the inevitable pressures and pains of public life. Mr. Speaker, to the wonderful people of South St. Andrew, who gave me their trust and elected me their Member of Parliament in October 2017. Many of our constituency executive members and other comrades are here to support me today. I want to big them up and thank them for their loyalty and teamwork as we strive to lift our constituency and put service before self. To the residents listening in Jonestown, Craigtown, Admiraltown, Arnett Gardens, Wilton Gardens, Lower Trench Town, Rosetown, Torrington Park, all the communities along the roads and lanes off Maxfield Avenue, Rousseau Road, Lincoln Road, Slipe Penn Road, Studio One Boulevard and Lyndhurst Road. Enough respect and thanks to you all. It is an honor and a privilege to represent you in this honorable house, and together we will make South St. Andrew the place to live, work, raise families, and do business. One love. Mr. Speaker, I thank our party president and leader of the opposition, Dr. Peter Phillips, for appointing me to shadow the portfolio of finance and planning. Yes. I am proud to sit beside you in this honorable house, sir. I continue to benefit from your experience and wisdom, your profound understanding of Jamaica's political history, your strategic intelligence, your deep and unwavering commitment to national development, and your personal friendship and support through good and bad times. It was gratifying to assist you in ensuring that Jamaica surpassed the many challenging legislative structural benchmarks of the IMF program, which you negotiated and then implemented with such dexterity and success as Minister of Finance and Planning in the last PMP government. Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge and honor our former party leader and Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Portia Simpson Miller. She allowed me to enter Parliament as a senator in September 2007. She also gave me the opportunity to serve in several important capacities, including in her cabinet. Many objective observers recognize that cabinet as one of, if not the most significant administrations to have managed the affairs of our country. Sister P always gave me her full support to drive the legislation and policies that I was working on as minister from January 2012 to February 2016. I honor her today as a great and iconic Jamaican woman of the people and an outstanding political leader. Mr. Speaker, I also recognize and pay tribute to Dr. Omar Davies, my predecessor Member of Parliament who retired from political life in June last year. In addition to his long service across many years in government, his many programs in South St. Andrew, especially in the field of education, are a valuable legacy on which I hope to build. Mr. Speaker, although I have been in this Parliament as part of the government and also the opposition for 10 years, and have sat both in this chamber and in the Senate, including as leader of opposition business there, I've never sought the limelight. I was always most comfortable holding my corner and doing my work. As a result, many Jamaicans do not know my story. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask if you please allow me to say a few words about myself. My professional background is in commercial law and investment finance, and I've made a career of growing successful businesses. I'm a partner in a law firm, which I joined in 1993 at 28 years old. At that time, there were just 3 other lawyers in the firm, all of them over 65. Today, that firm has 19 lawyers, and I'm grateful to say, enjoys the trust of its clients and the respect of its peers. My senior partner, the Honorable Hugh Hart, OJ, as my mentor in commercial law, was a former Minister of Tourism, Mining and Energy in the JLP administration of the 1980s. We know that when it comes to serious business and achieving results, there is no place for tribal politics. Mr. Speaker, in 1992, I joined with 2 friends who were young bankers, one of whom is a member from Central Manchester, and started Jamaica's first investment bank, DBNG. With youthful enthusiasm, we listed the company as a mere startup on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, and we grew the business for the next 14 years. So successful was that business that an international bank with a long history in Jamaica bought the company at that time, providing a significant return for the shareholders, including the employees of the company, through the Employee Share Ownership Plan, ESOP, that we had established. 4 years later, I joined with a few of my former colleagues in DBNG, again including my friend and colleague, the member from Central Manchester, to start a new regionally based investment company, which is also listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. It is proven, and as it thrives, it is creating tremendous value for its stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, it is that experience and the success that I've enjoyed in law and business which fueled my desire to make a further contribution to my beloved country, Jamaica, which has been so good to me. Mr. Speaker, there are many ways in which one can honorably serve one's country, but as you know, the form of public service that can have the most profound and far-reaching impact, for better or for worse, is public service through politics. Politicians make the laws that govern our people, and politicians decide how the state's resources are deployed. In the last PNP administration, my role was twofold. As Minister of Justice, I was responsible for pursuing the justice reform agenda. We made significant strides with programs funded by our international development partners and some important, innovative legislation of our own. While I'm happy that there has been significant continuity in these programs under Minister Chuck, there still remains much more to be done. My other role was managing the legislative agenda of the government, which was particularly heavy because of the structural reforms to reorient the Jamaican economy towards sustainable debt reduction, high levels of investment, greater competitiveness, economic growth, and job creation. These fundamental national objectives and specific reforms were embedded in the IMF program as structural benchmarks, with delivery dates attached to every single one of them. Mr. Speaker, we met every single one of them and on time. I want to thank the technical staff in the Ministry of Justice and the Cabinet Office who assisted me at that time, and of course, all my Cabinet colleagues and my fellow senators who enabled a lot of legislation to be passed at that time. We worked hard and did the right thing for the people and the country. Mr. Speaker, I wish to remind the country of some of the significant achievements of the last PNP administration, which turned Jamaica's economic fortunes around. They continue to pay significant dividends today and will do so well into the future. It is well recognized that Jamaica's abnormally high levels of violent crime have a major negative effect on investment and the growth of our economy. Mr. Speaker, our administration made significant strides towards making Jamaica a safer place in which to live. From January 2012 to December 2015, Jamaica averaged 300 less murders per year than in the 4 years under the JLP before us. Similarly, murders were 300 less per year under our watch than in the 2 years under the JLP since they took over. Our much stronger performance in reducing serious crimes resulted from several deliberate and strategic policies. Firstly, we improved the police-citizen relationship by removing many sources of friction and enhancing cooperation. Fatal shootings by the police went down under our watch by 67% to less than 100 per year by 2015, the lowest recorded in decades. We decriminalized possession of small quantities of ganja, which has resulted in 14,000 fewer arrests per year, mainly of so-called unattached youth. We eliminated criminal records for minor ganja offenses, benefiting again many thousands of Jamaicans. And Mr. Speaker, we provided hundreds of new vehicles for the police force to improve their mobility and their ability to fight crime. Mr. Speaker, we also enacted strategic legislation to tackle violent crime. We passed the anti-gang legislation targeting criminal gang activity, which is a major cause of murders in Jamaica. We passed the anti-lotto scamming legislation to provide the legal tools that have been used since to target the dangerous phenomenon of lotto scamming. We passed the DNA Evidence Act with a modern legal framework for collecting and using DNA for investigations and as evidence in court. We put a legal limit of $1 million on cash transactions outside the regulated financial system to fight against money laundering and corruption. We amended the shipwrighter law to give it more teeth to fight the dangerous guns for drugs trade that brings illegal weapons and ammunition into our country. Mr. Speaker, we also gave unprecedented attention to tackling the socio-economic causes of crime. Carefully designed crime prevention measures, such as Unite for Change and the End Violence Project, were introduced, with strong funding support under the Citizen Security and Justice Program, CSJP-3. These are some of the measures, Mr. Speaker, that helped us to significantly lower the murder rate in our country. Mr. Speaker, I now move to our economic performance. Our administration undertook major tax reform that has helped transform Jamaica's economy by enabling significantly higher level of tax collections than ever before. We reformed the system of tax incentives to create a level playing field that does not discriminate between different sectors of the economy. Instead, it incentivizes employment creation and investments in retooling and expansion across all industries. We established Tax Administration Jamaica, TAJ, as a semi-autonomous revenue agency with its own board to provide policy guidance and good governance. We introduced the Revenue Administration Information System, RAISE, a technology platform that has transformed the effectiveness of tax administration in Jamaica. We introduced laws to counter the transfer pricing that had been eroding the country's tax base for years. And we strengthened the enforcement powers through legislation to give the TAJ significantly enhanced tools to collect revenue, such as the power to access third-party information and to collect third-party debts owing to delinquent taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, our administration also modernized Jamaica's commercial architecture. We passed landmark legislation to create a modern insolvency law focused on rehabilitating businesses that fall into financial distress, and that was the Insolvency Act. We established a modern legislative system for taking collateral for secured financing to allow greater access to credit for our people and businesses. This allows the use of non-traditional forms of collateral, Mr. Speaker, such as crops, livestock, copyright, and other intellectual property, as well as accounts receivable. That was the Security Interest in Personal Property Act, Mr. Speaker. This legislation was important because we believe in bringing small businesses and farmers into the mainstream of the economy, as this is what leads to inclusive growth. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we passed legislation to make Jamaica Customs an executive agency and to support the implementation of the world standard Asikuda system at our ports to increase productivity and make Jamaica more internationally competitive. And we passed legislation to introduce a single super form for starting a business or a company, so that business persons now get all the bureaucratic registrations to have their businesses up and running from day one. Mr. Speaker, we did all this because it was right for our people and our country. These measures resulted in Jamaica's international ranking for ease of doing business improving significantly under our watch. In the annual Doing Business report published by the World Bank, 189 countries are ranked for ease of doing business across 10 indicators. Mr. Speaker, the 2015 report had Jamaica moving up a whopping 27 places from 85th to 58th. As a result of this, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica achieved the Caribbean's highest ranking for ease of doing business at that time. This signaled to the world that Jamaica was open for business. Despite the hype about going for growth, Mr. Speaker, nowadays, the grim reality is that this government's record in this particular area has been quite poor. Jamaica's ranking in the World Doing Business report has steadily fallen over the past 2 years. From 58th, Jamaica's ranking in the World Doing Business report has steadily fallen over the last 2 years, from 58th, where we left it, to 70th position in 2018. Mr. Speaker, this is turning back the progress. Mr. Speaker, the government has dropped the ball by failing to continue the aggressive drive for improving business conditions in our country. To improve bureaucratic processes, Mr. Speaker, the devil is in the details. You must get into the specific procedures that govern the bureaucracy and re-engineer them to support rather than frustrate business. Mr. Speaker, this government has done virtually nothing in this vital area in the 2 years since they assumed office. Mr. Speaker, I want to take a few moments to talk about some key statistics. Mr. Speaker, I want to take a few moments to talk about some key statistics that are relevant to appreciating the true state of the Jamaican economy and put in context much of what we have heard over the last few days from the government side. Mr. Speaker, the government has been crowing that unemployment has been coming down. Let me remind the nation that following its peak at 15.3% in 2013, during the early days of the economic reform program, unemployment has been trending down every year since then. By July 2015, we had brought unemployment down to 13.1%, and by July 2016, we had brought it further down to 12.9%. And we are pleased that this is continuing. It didn't start with you, it started with us. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we were looking after our people. We regularly increased the minimum wage. Regularly. We increased the NIS pension. And Mr. Speaker, we increased the income tax threshold several times, but without raising taxes to do so. Mr. Speaker, that was prudent economic management. We also brought inflation. We also brought inflation under control, taking it down to levels not seen in 40 years. For fiscal year 2015-16, for fiscal year 2015-16, the inflation rate was 3.0%. However, since this administration assumed office, inflation has been moving upwards. For the 2016-17 fiscal year, inflation was 4.1%. And for calendar year 2017, inflation hit 5.2% for the year just finished. And it's projected to be 5.0% for this 2017-18 fiscal year. So we have to watch that carefully, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we inherited the national debt at close to 150% of GDP in 2012, in the mid-140s. Over the next 4 years, we brought it down to 127% of GDP. And Mr. Speaker, if you apply the new definition of public debt that is now being used, we actually brought it down to 119% of GDP by the time we demitted office. From the mid-140s to 119% of GDP if you adjust and use the new definition that is now being used by the government. Mr. Speaker, we were doing what was right for the people and the country. Mr. Speaker, the bold and innovative Petrocarib debt buyback, which members of the current JLP government opposed at the time, brought Jamaica ahead of its debt reduction program and was celebrated internationally as a landmark transaction. It was after that transaction, the Petrocarib debt buyback, that the IMF agreed to the reduction of the primary surplus target for Jamaica from 7.5% initially to 7.25%, and then down further to 7.0% of GDP, creating more fiscal space for much-needed public investment. Mr. Speaker, the Minister on Thursday proclaimed proudly that interest rates on government instruments have been falling. Once again, Mr. Speaker, this is the continuation of a trend which started in 2013-14 under our administration. The 180-day Treasury bill rate, which had been increasing while the country's finances were in disarray, peaked at 8.87% in 2013-14. Since then, our sound economic management resulted in a steady reduction of that interest rate to 5.83% at the end of the 2015-16 fiscal year, and it has been continuing since. It is a similar story, Mr. Speaker, for the balance of payments, which measures Jamaica's ability to finance its exports. When we assumed office in 2012, Jamaica had a current account deficit of US dollars 1.9 billion, or 12.9% of GDP. By the end of fiscal year 2015-16, when we left office, the current account deficit had declined to 2.4% of GDP, from 12.9 to 2.4% of GDP, Mr. Speaker. We note with concern that Mr. Speaker, we note with concern that Statin has recently reported that for the calendar year 2017, Jamaica's trade deficit was $4.5 billion US, a substantial increase of 23.1% over calendar year 2016. Imports grew by $1 billion US, or 20% in 2017 over 2016, while exports only grew by 120 million. The widening of the trade deficit, Mr. Speaker, is a worrying trend. Of the 5.8 billion US of imports in 2017, motor vehicles and fuel accounted for almost 3 billion US. Mr. Speaker, fuel prices have been rising, now in the vicinity of $62 US per barrel, depending which benchmark you use. There is no doubt that a substantial part of the increase in bank credit to the private sector that the Minister talked about last Thursday is financing the importation of motor vehicles, which does very little for the growth agenda and helps to drive the trade deficit. I am concerned, Mr. Speaker, about the sustainability of this trend, because we need to be financing production and exports to pay for the lifestyle we want to live. Mr. Speaker, the Minister spoke of the high level of business confidence now prevailing. This again is another trend that began during our administration. For example, on January 21st, 2015, the Gleaner reported that, and I quote, "Business and consumer confidence improved in the December quarter, one of the few occasions in which the indices moved up at the same time, and the first time that a majority of firms have expressed a willingness to invest. Optimism among Jamaican firms posted a quarterly gain of 9.5% and recorded an annual gain of 25.1%. I close quote. That was in January 2015, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, our economic management was building confidence in the country. Indeed, the high levels of business confidence now being experienced are a continuation of that trend, which started under the last PNP administration. We were doing what was right for the people and the country. And Mr. Speaker, perhaps the strongest testament to this is that in 2015, the final full year of the last PNP government, the Jamaica Stock Exchange was the top performing stock exchange in the world. On December 30th, 2015, Bloomberg News released an article entitled, "It's Jamming, Jamaica Tiny Stock Market Conquers World in 2015. That was the article, the title of the article in Bloomberg News. And the article read as follows, and I quote, "Jamaica may bring to mind rum, daiquiris, and Bob Marley, but its stock market had a better year than any other across the globe. Foreign acquisitions, stronger investor safeguards, and a rebounding economy helped the Jamaica Stock Exchange surge more than 80% in 2015, close quote. Mr. Speaker, that 80% return on the Jamaican stock market in 2015 remains a standard that has not been repeated under this government. What we were doing was right for the people and the country. Mr. Speaker, our administration conceptualized a logistics-centered economy, integrating Jamaica into the world supply chain as a value-adding hub in as many areas of goods and services as possible. That was a vision that we had. This was a big and bold idea, and it had its detractors, including some members on that side. But we pressed on and commenced the development of the Logistics Hub Master Plan that has recently been completed. It guided our strategic vision of the economy and where we placed emphasis in encouraging investments. Mr. Speaker, this is why the major projects that have come on stream in recent times were initiated by our administration, and I will list some of them. The North-South Highway Project was launched in 2007 by then Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller. It later stalled, Mr. Speaker, it later stalled under the Bruce Golding administration when the Contractor General brought it to a halt over alleged procurement violations. Our administration got it back on track. Dr. Davis, take a bow, Dr. Davis. We got it back on track and completed the highway. Mr. Speaker, now you can cross the island from Caymanas to the north coast in under 45 minutes on a first-class highway through our beautiful mountains. This has opened up immense opportunities for the economy. Many companies have improved their efficiency and expanded operations because of this valuable national asset. Mr. Speaker, that is foresight. That was planning with a vision. We were doing what was right for the people and the country. Mr. Speaker, we negotiated and signed a concession deal with CMA-CGM, one of the largest shipping companies in the world, to expand the operation of the Kingston Container Terminal. As a result, the Port of Kingston will have the depth and berthing capacity to receive the new generation of mega ships that are now crossing the expanded Panama Canal. We recognize, Mr. Speaker, that Jamaica must not be left out of an increasingly integrated global economy. And this government closed the deal at the end, and that deal is now being implemented, and we're happy for that. Mr. Speaker, the boom in the BPO sector began under our watch, guided by a 5-year master plan that we developed with the aim of creating at least 50,000 jobs over that period. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is well on the way to achieving that target now. Mr. Speaker, we sought out and negotiated the deal with Disco, a leading Chinese company, to acquire and reopen the alumina refinery at Alpart that had closed in 2008. And Mr. Speaker, when that refinery closed in 2008,
I'm going to ask you to take a few seconds rest while the leader of government business seek an extension for you to proceed. Mr. Warmington, the time for speaking with the members has expired.
Mr. Speaker, move that the member's time is extended sufficiently for him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Warmington. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that we sought out and negotiated the deal with Disco, a leading Chinese company, to acquire and reopen the alumina refinery at Alpart. When that closed in 2008, Mr. Speaker, it crippled economic life in much of central Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, Disco has announced recently a US $6 billion plan to significantly expand the refinery, including a new power plant and an industrial park. Once executed, it will be the largest investment project in Jamaica's history, conceptualized and initiated by our administration. We were doing what was right for the people and the country, and the member for East Kingston and Port Royal played a seminal role in that transaction. Mr. Speaker, we initiated a massive flow of the hotel investments, which will ultimately result in several hotels totaling, I'm told, about 16,000 new hotel rooms from over 60 billion of investment coming into this country. While most of the investment has come from overseas, local companies have also participated in this boom. Sagicor Group Jamaica undertook its major expansion in the hotel sector, acquiring and renovating several major resort hotel properties during our administration. And the Hendrickson family continued to acquire and refurbish major business hotels in the corporate area, and we salute these investors. Several major brands were brought to Jamaica in this time, from Marriott to the Charisma Group and the Royalton and others, Sensatori and so on. And I must salute the work of the person to my left, former Minister of Tourism, the member for Western Westmoreland. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned that our government created a level playing field of tax incentives available across all sectors of the economy. At the time we introduced this far-reaching reform, some were saying, and I quote, if you repeal the Hotel Incentives Act and replace it with what is being proposed, you will not see a single hotel room being built in Jamaica in the foreseeable future, close quotes. Well, Mr. Speaker, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Since we introduced those tax incentive reforms, Jamaica has seen a wave of expansion in the hotel sector that is driving visitor arrivals, increasing foreign exchange inflows, creating jobs for our people and opportunities for our farmers, transport operators, craftsmen, and entertainers. Again, Mr. Speaker, we were doing what was right for the people and the country. Mr. Speaker, I move to energy. The high cost of energy and electricity has been recognized as a serious impediment to Jamaica being a competitive economy that can attract investment and generate growth. Our administration did the work that has transformed the energy sector through a series of critical initiatives, which I must mention, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the institutional framework that then existed simply was not working. So we established the Energy Sector Enterprise Team, ESET, comprised of persons with strong technical and commercial experience, headed by Dr. Vin Lawrence, to lead the charge in procuring new and more efficient generating capacity for the country. Mr. Speaker, we also signed a landmark energy agreement with the US government when President Obama visited in 2015, resulting in the US allowing their LNG to be exported to Jamaica, making us the first country outside of NAFTA to enjoy that benefit. Mr. Speaker, we brought New Fortress Energy to Jamaica, enabling the Bogue power plant of JPS to be converted to LNG and commencing the investment to establish a major LNG facility on the south coast that will supply Jamaica's LNG needs and will also be a hub for the distribution of LNG around the Caribbean. We implemented and started that project. Mr. Speaker, work commenced to establish a major new 190 megawatt LNG fueled power plant to replace JPSCO's very old and inefficient units in Old Harbour. Mr. Speaker, we made an aggressive thrust to reduce Jamaica's excessive reliance on fossil fuels and diversify into renewable sources such as solar and wind power, resulting again in major investments, including the largest solar energy facility in the English-speaking Caribbean. And Mr. Speaker, we passed a new Electricity Act to provide the legal framework to support these critical initiatives and provide more transparency in the costing and pricing of electricity to consumers. Mr. Speaker, the result of our efforts was a substantial reduction in the cost of electricity to consumers and businesses. We also removed GCT from the bulk of electricity charges paid by consumers. Sadly, this government has reversed that. So, Mr. Speaker, all these goodies and more were handed to the current government on a platter in February 2016. As a result of the strong economic management by the last PNP administration, when we handed over the reins of power in 2016, Jamaica was poised for high levels of economic growth and job creation. And Mr. Speaker, we are pleased that the overall macroeconomic program being pursued by this government is essentially one of continuity, with a commitment to the reduction of the national debt by maintaining annual primary surpluses of at least 7% of GDP under the 3-year precautionary standby arrangement with the IMF that commenced in the final quarter of 2016. But Mr. Speaker, I have something I want to say on this. The current IMF program will come to an end next year. The country has benefited greatly from the establishment of EPOC, which has monitored successive governments' adherence to the fiscal targets under the IMF programs since 2013. EPOC provides regular detailed reports to the public on Jamaica's fiscal and economic performance. and this promotes transparency and encourages governments not to go off track. EPAC has also built a credible reputation by providing objective, non-partisan analysis based on factual data provided to it by the relevant agencies of government. It has broad representation, which has helped to bring the whole country along through the challenging implementation of major economic reforms. I am therefore recommending, Mr. Speaker, that whenever Jamaica ceases to have an IMF program, a body modeled on EPAC should simultaneously be established in law with the statutory mandate to monitor and report to the public on the government's adherence to principles of sound fiscal management, whichever government it may be. This will help to maintain the people's confidence and the confidence of local and international investors and observers in Jamaica's economic management. It will make permanent what has become an important national institution in ensuring that Jamaica never slips back into large deficits and mounting debt. It will continue to complement and enhance the fiscal responsibility framework that is already enshrined in our law. Mr. Speaker, our people have sacrificed too much for too long, and we must maintain the institutions that we have created that have shown that they are effective and have broad support across the society. Good idea. The continuity in macroeconomic management has paid dividends in the international capital markets, Mr. Speaker, as Jamaica continues to access financing on increasingly better terms and has successfully executed several liability management transactions following on from our landmark Petrocaribe buyback. We are also pleased to see the positive outcomes of the many reforms that were implemented by our administration and being reflected now in the growth in tax collections. Tax revenues, Mr. Speaker, have increased from $411.8 billion in fiscal year 2015-16, $411 billion, to $458.3 billion in fiscal year 2016-17, and are projected to be $478 billion in this fiscal year. This represents an increase of 16% over 2 years, at a time when the economy has only seen very marginal real GDP growth during that 2-year period. Mr. Speaker, this improved revenue performance did not happen by accident. It is not being driven by the anemic economic growth which has occurred either. It is clear that our administration's reforms of the tax system are bearing fruit, even with the underperformance of the economy in the past 2 fiscal years and the slow pace of economic growth. We also note, Mr. Speaker, that the best performing tax type for this fiscal year has been the company income tax, which as at December 2017 was $6.7 billion over budget, and for fiscal year 2018-19 is projected to be 26.27% more than the revised estimates for fiscal year 2017-18. 26.27 more is what they're projecting for company tax in the coming year. Mr. Speaker, this strong performance in company income tax has no obvious connection with the so-called 1.5 that the government has been gloating about. Significantly, corporate income tax is fake news. Corporate income tax is way up, despite the fact that our administration reduced the corporate tax rate on all companies outside the regulatory sectors from 33.3% to equalize it at 25% with the individual income tax rate. So we brought the tax rate on companies to the same rate as it is on individuals, 25%, save and except those that are in regulated sectors. And despite that reduction in interest in tax rates, the tax take from companies has been growing and growing, and it's projected to grow again by 26.27% in the coming fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the compliance measures that we introduced, which I have referred to already, the employment tax credit has provided a strong incentive to companies to be compliant with their taxes, as well as incentivizing the employment of workers. Mr. Speaker, under the employment tax credit, the ETC, the employer company gets a tax credit of up to 30% of its workforce's statutory deductions, as long as they're paid on time. This innovation, which was introduced by the last PNP government, has created a win-win situation for the revenue and the wider economy by boosting tax compliance and at the same time incentivizing employment by companies. Sound economic management, Mr. Speaker, requires bold reforms, and we are proud of our record of innovation, effort and achievement that is bearing so many fruits. And at this point, Mr. Speaker, I just want to pause to mention that I wish to support the call made in the Standing Finance Committee by the member for Central Manchester that the threshold at which small businesses are required to register as GCT taxpayers be substantially increased from its current level of annual sales of about $3 million a year. We need to reduce the cost of tax compliance imposed on the small business sector, Mr. Speaker. These small entrepreneurs cannot afford to hire accountants to prepare monthly GCT returns. Mr. Speaker, we anticipate that the fiscal cost of this measure will be relatively small, but it will be of great assistance to the small business sector. It will relieve them of the burden of having to register and file GCT returns until their businesses have grown to a size where it is reasonable to ask them to do so. But it should not be mandatory, sir. We would argue that firms that wish to register should be able to opt in, but it should not be mandatory until their annual sales have reached a substantially high level. And we commend that idea to you for your consideration. Give a break to small businesses, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the JLP government has been on a crusade to portray itself as the party of economic growth. However, the record since 2005 shows that this is fake news. And Mr. Speaker, it's time to mash down that lie. If you look at the period from 2005 to the present day, and exclude from it the 2 years when there were transitions from one government to another, excluding those 2 years, the cumulative growth of the JLP when they were in office during that period was negative 3.1%. In contrast, the cumulative growth while the PNP was in office during that period was positive 6%. Mr. Speaker, the record speaks for itself. Mr. Speaker, I have spent some time giving an overview of what we did the last time we were at the crease. I think it's important that we do this to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, how critical it is to have continuity of sound policies where there's a change of administration, when the initiatives and approaches have been shown to have clear economic benefit. As the legendary investor Warren Buffett said, and I quote, "Someone is sitting in the shade today because someone else planted a tree," close quote. Mr. Speaker, sometimes he who sows does not get the credit when the crop is reaped. That is how life is. But what really matters, Mr. Speaker, is that Jamaica is reaping the benefit. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, while we endorse the continuity of our macroeconomic program, because it is the only way to get the country out of the debt trap, we do have some serious concerns. Mr. Speaker, this 2018-19 budget shows no increases to adequately make up for inflation over the past year in the crucial areas of education, the police, health, agriculture, and justice. And Mr. Speaker, we see these as misplaced priorities that are not meeting Jamaica's needs. There are potential... Before I go into the details, I think it's worth saying something about the international environment, because we are not isolated from the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, there are potential risks to Jamaica from the changes occurring in the international economy. Growth and employment in the major economies have been healthy, and central banks across the world have begun to normalize their monetary policy measures that were necessary to respond to the 2008 crisis. In that time, there had to be a huge expansion of credit because of the need to ensure that the world didn't go back into the dark days of the world recession of the 1920s. With the world economy having bounced back, monetary policies were being normalized again. Interest rates are rising, and the recent tax reforms in the United States are projected to generate large medium-term budget deficits, which will tend to give further upward momentum to interest rates. Mr. Speaker, the new tariff policies announced recently by the US government have the potential to lead to a spiral of responses from affected economies around the world, which could impact Jamaica's goods and services and increase, in terms of exports, and also increase the cost of our imports. Therefore, with our high level of external debt, Mr. Speaker, and our open economy, Jamaica will not be isolated from these trends. And I would only mention here that we all have high hopes for the bauxite and alumina sector. But one of the two metals upon which tariffs have been imposed is aluminium. So we need to be mindful of that. Mr. Speaker, by President Trump. The vulnerability of our economy to the impact of climate change is also worrying. Agriculture, Mr. Speaker, is a major contributor to Jamaica's GDP, but it is the most exposed sector to droughts and excessive rainfall. The government must develop a comprehensive plan to build resilience to climate change generally, and in the agricultural sector in particular, to help our farmers be consistently productive. In that context, Mr. Speaker, it is startling that the budget for the ministry, which includes agriculture, has been reduced for the coming fiscal year relative to the fiscal year now ending. Mr. Speaker, murders have gone through the roof since this government took office. 2016 was a bad year for safety and security. Despite the reckless assurances given by political leaders on election platforms, no one has been able to sleep at night with their windows and doors open. No one. When the budget... Mr. Speaker, when the budget for this fiscal year when the budget for this fiscal year that's ending was brought to the House last year, the opposition warned that national security was being substantially underfunded, and we called on the government to recalibrate that budget so that the spiraling murder rate could be effectively tackled by law enforcement. Our call was not heeded. National security was compromised, and murders went up by a further 25% in 2017 over 2016, and 1,616 Jamaicans lost their lives. Mr. Speaker, our Unite for Change program has been abandoned, but the government's HOPE program is underfunded and will only scratch the surface of this urgent national challenge. If we are to turn Jamaica around, we must invest in these youths. Too often, it is the youngsters who are recruited into scamming and criminal gangs that feed the very high murder rate. The frightening year-on-year increase in murders since this government took office is sapping the national spirit and spreading a general sense of fear. And everybody is affected by it, Mr. Speaker. Everybody. Mr. Speaker, what the people want are real solutions. Instead, what we got was a misguided policy of buying used cars for the police, followed by a contract of over 400 million to purchase 200 used cars, which has become a major scandal plaguing the government. Mr. Speaker, a look at the national security budget for the coming fiscal year shows that the police force is not being well looked after. The capital A budget for the military is increasing from 2.4 million to 8.4 billion to 8.4 billion. Over $6 billion for the military more, capital A. Mostly to buy helicopters and vehicles and for the military, and to pay for cyber security initiatives, again, for the military. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, the capital A budget for the police is only increasing from 1.99 billion to 2.59 billion. That is about $500 million. Of this increase, only $313 million is for the purchase of vehicles. And we are told by the minister, that he's sticking to his policy of buying used cars for the police. And Mr. Speaker, on the recurrent side of the national security budget, on the recurrent side, there is 5.2 billion of additional expenditure on the military again for 2018-19, of which 3.1 billion is for additional soldiers to be added to the army. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, the overall recurrent budget for the police force is actually being reduced by 93 million, even though the police force has 3,000 less police officers than it needs. Mr. Speaker, this lack of balance in the national crimes. It is the police who have the power to arrest criminals. Except in states of emergency and zones of special operations, the military does not have those powers and cannot play that role. It is the police who prepare cases for prosecution so that there is evidence to convict criminals. Mr. Speaker, this budget does not reflect a coherent crime plan. We are told by many experts that violent crime has been costing Jamaica at least 4% per annum in GDP growth. If we believe that, we must move with haste to properly fund the police and give. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, a major emphasis on early childhood education, supported by a comprehensive policy to address the broader needs of children from birth until mid-childhood, will be prioritized. Our basic schools in Jamaica are currently organized in an ad hoc system that is not delivering the outcomes that the country needs. Jamaica needs an early childhood education system that gets all our children off to the right start. We believe that Jamaica can and must achieve the outcome that all our children are able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic by grade 4, supported by proper nutrition and exposure to the social skills and wholesome values that are fundamental to citizenship. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, a national program to engage and reorient the lives of so-called unattached youths is essential to put them on a pathway of hope for a better life for themselves and their families. Mr. Speaker, these youths need mentorship, they need life skills, they need the building of their self-esteem and a sense of citizenship, they need vocational training, and they need a chance of remedial education, and they need an opportunity to know what it is like to have a job. This program must therefore be holistic in its approach and also realistic in addressing the needs of these youngsters so that they stay the course and get the full benefit of the program. Fourthly, Mr. Speaker, the financing of tertiary education needs to be transformed, especially for young people whose parents just don't have it. Our young people who have defied the odds of financially challenged circumstances to make it to university or college struggle to get through to the end of their courses because of the inadequacy of the current arrangements for financing tertiary education. And sadly, Mr. Speaker, many of them are not able to complete their degrees. We need to explore ways of fixing student loan payments to a reasonable percentage of their earned income over time. The government is examining ways to balance the risk of joblessness between the society as a whole and the student, the particular student, in a more sustainable manner. And the opposition is examining those ways. We are also of the view, Mr. Speaker, that in a climate of limited resources, the tertiary financing program should prioritize cost areas that provide the skills most needed to support a modern economy. That is essential. Mr. Speaker, investing in our human capital must be the driver for high levels of excellence that Jamaica needs. It will create a virtuous circle of greater social cohesion and more wealth creation. No one is yet persuaded in the world that they owe us a living, and no one is giving us anything for free. We must compete with the best, and God has given us the natural talents and a strong national spirit and the cultural confidence to do so. Mr. Speaker, this is not the time to roll out the specifics of our policies and programs to tackle the real issues confronting Jamaica, but I have given you an indication of the orientation of some of the priorities of the next PNP administration. Mr. Speaker, taxation policy is one of the most important tools available to the state to drive social justice, equality of opportunity, and a Jamaica that works for all. Taxation policy is critical. Mr. Speaker, the main feature of the budgets of the fiscal years 2016-17 and 2017-18 was the two-phased increase in the income tax threshold from $592,800, just under $600,000, to $1.5 million per annum. Mr. Speaker, the financing of the two phases of increases to the income tax threshold was achieved by additional tax measures totaling $30.9 billion, largely through various forms of indirect taxation, which have been a burden on the consumers in this economy at a time when growth has stagnated. Mr. Speaker, the Planning Institute of Jamaica produced a report dated April 8, 2017, entitled Measuring the Impact of Government of Jamaica Tax Reform Measures on Consumption Expenditure. The PIOJ, that's the 31 billion of taxes. That report assessed the impact of moving away from the direct taxation system that we had and increasing the income tax threshold to 1.5 million. And it pointed out, Mr. Speaker, that according to the Jamaica Labour Force Survey of 2015, the informal sector of this country accounted for over 60% of total employment, while the formal sector accounted for under 40%, 39.6%. This means, Mr. Speaker, that the majority of Jamaica's employed labour force does not have a formal tax-paying relationship and has not benefited from the increase in the income tax threshold. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, persons who are unemployed or only informally employed do not benefit from the increase in an income tax threshold. But these persons have to purchase goods and services which require the payment of indirect taxes, such as GCT and SCT. And that is true whether those taxes are charged on the purchase of goods and services that they consume or are indirectly incurred through their purchases of services, the cost of which includes substantial indirect taxes on production inputs, such as electricity and transport services. Mr. Speaker, those who are suffering from the over 30 billion of indirect taxation imposed by this government, for whom prosperity remains a fleeting and painful illusion, include pensioners who have not had an increase, household helpers, security guards, other lower wage earners, and of course, the unemployed. None of them has benefited from the so-called 1.5. Over 100,000 NIS pensioners are worse off. Over 400,000 self-employed persons are worse off, including farmers, hairdressers and barbers, taxis, minibus operators, shopkeepers, bar owners, mechanics. They're all worse off. In other words, Mr. Speaker, this government's tax policy involves the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. prosperity for the few, sufferation for the many. Mr. Speaker, this is borne out by our experiences as members of Parliament, in particular those of us who represent constituencies where most of the residents are in lower income groups. It is particularly painful that those who bought into the announcement of the so-called 1.5 and the promise, the illusion of $18,000 per month of extra cash in their pockets are now facing the harsh reality of $30 billion of additional taxation. The political propaganda at the time said that there would be no additional taxes to pay for it. The government's two budgets before this one, imposing over $30 billion of new taxes, have shown that this was a false promise and fake news. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance last Thursday denied that the 1.5 was sold to the Jamaican people on the basis that there would be no new taxes to pay for it. Well, here is a JLP political advertisement from the last general election, which mashes down that lie. It said, we can afford it, it said. And then it goes on to say the increase in the income tax threshold to 1.5 million could be done without any new taxes. See there, highlighted in bold print. Mr. Speaker, had the Jamaican people not been hoodwinked by that deception, had they realized that the JLP had not thought this 1.5 plan through, and that it would in fact cost ordinary Jamaicans an additional $30 billion in new taxes on consumers, that tax plan would never have seen the light of day. Mr. Speaker, there was no mention then of any shift in policy from direct to indirect taxation. None at all. In fact, it was costed in their propaganda at $12.5 billion, and they even itemized how it was to be paid for, all of which the people now know was a scam. It was a scam. The audit firm PricewaterhouseCoopers newsletter on the 2016-17 tax measures stated, and I quote, a total of $13.78 billion in new taxes were announced to fund the initial phased increase of the tax-free threshold, initially to $1,272,000, which is estimated to cost for this fiscal year $12.5 billion. The budget for that year was nearly halfway through the year. $16.7 billion on an annualized basis. Close quote. In the budget, Mr. Speaker, in the budget for fiscal year 2017-18, when you throw stone in a pig pen, Mr. Speaker, in the budget for fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, let's give me a little protection, please, sir. A little protection from my good friends over there. Mr. Speaker.
Stand back from the top. Order, please. Order. Tavares.
Easier, sir. In the budget for fiscal, easier, sir, man. In the budget for fiscal year 2017-18, Mr. Speaker, a further $13.5 billion in new taxes were imposed to pay for the second phase of the increase in the tax threshold. Mr. Speaker, the rationalization.
The Hampshire writers cannot hear the member. Everybody on both sides, please. Give the Hampshire a chance to listen to the speaker. Order, please. Go ahead, Mr. Golden.
Mr. Speaker, the rationalization that came after the 2016 general election has been that the 1.5 represents a deliberate policy of shifting to indirect taxation from direct taxation on incomes. However, in a society like Jamaica, where incomes and wealth are so unevenly distributed, this tax policy worsens the inequities, weakens the fabric of our stressed society, and imposes a social injustice on the majority of Jamaican people. I'm flattered. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance and the Public Service has proudly announced that there are no new taxes in the coming year's budget. But were it not, order please. Mr. Speaker, were it not for the need to raise taxes to pay for the 1.5, there would not have been a need for additional taxes after our administration restored the public finances and eliminated the fiscal deficits that were driving up the national debt. We were on a trajectory, Mr. Speaker, to arrive at no new taxes from 2016. And the reason why you had to introduce 13 billion of new taxes in 2016 was to pay for your 1.5. Otherwise, there would have been no new taxes in 2016. The only taxes that you imposed in 2017 were to pay for the second phase of the 1.5. So, Mr. Speaker, your no new taxes is 3 budgets late, and your government is fully responsible for the delay. Mr. Speaker,
repeat it again. Repeat it.
You want me to repeat it? No, go on. But, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Members.
It looks like a beetroot, man.
Mr. Golden, proceed.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is more to it than that. There is more to it than that, Mr. Speaker. The minister told us last Thursday that tax revenues are 5 billion over target for the current year. And the revenue estimates that we have before us project that tax revenues for the coming fiscal year will be $40 billion more than the fiscal year just ending. 40 billion more. What particularly disappoints us, Mr. Speaker, is despite all the additional revenue that the tax reforms have been successfully bringing into the government's coffers, the minister has not chosen to take even a little bit off of the annual 30.9 billion of additional indirect taxes that have hit the wider society, especially the vast majority who have never benefited from the 1.5. Not even 1% of the GCT, Minister. Not a single tax break for the unemployed, the minimum wage earner, the pensioner. Mr. Speaker, reducing the tax on fuel would perhaps have had the biggest multiplier effect on the economy, as inflation would fall and it would boost aggregate demand. And it would boost aggregate real demand. Any way you cut it, Mr. Speaker, lowering the taxes on the majority who live on the margins of society and must consume every dollar that they can find just to stay alive would help to drive the aggregate demand and inject more life into the economy. It is a pity, Mr. Speaker, it is a pity that this opportunity for some tax relief for the majority has been ignored by the government in this budget. And this is all the more serious when one considers that the increase in NIS pension, which we had made provision for when we demitted office, has not been granted. The pensioners have had to absorb the price increases from your love of indirect taxation without any increase since 2013. The minimum wage, which you promised to double, has not increased by $1 in the 2 years since you took office. Mr. Speaker, our hero from Trenchtown taught us to say, "Soldier say, not one of my seed shall sit on the sidewalk and beg bread." Well, Mr. Speaker, for the majority of Jamaicans, especially the most vulnerable, the dirty tough pot a cook, but the food not enough. And Mr. Speaker, path is no answer to their cries, Mr. Speaker. Path is no answer. I want to give It's all right, man. Them have some more licks to get. Them have some more licks to get. Want some more water in this. Some more water in this. Mr. Speaker. Hold on. Control the side, please, sir. The path, Mr. Speaker, is no answer to their cries. I'm going to give you a real-life example of how dread it is to those who rely on path. It is really no bed of roses. The other day, Mr. B, I'm going to call him Mr. B, respect his anonymity. Now, Mr. B came to see me in my constituency office. He is 52 years old and was a victim of a stroke some years ago. He lives alone, without much help because his 2 daughters have children and are themselves struggling. He has to walk slowly and painfully with the aid of a stick. Under the path, Mr. Speaker, he gets $5,000 every 2 months. That is not survival. That is destitution. Mr. Speaker, it is immoral that at a time when tax revenues are projected to increase by over $40 billion in the coming fiscal year, not $1 of tax savings has been passed on to people like Mr. B. And there are thousands and thousands like him in every constituency across Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, to be poor is a crime, it is often said. We need a Zoso on poverty in this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to touch a little on the public sector pay issue. That's a shame. That's a shame. Last week, Thursday, the minister said a great deal about the government's pay offer to the public sector workers. Well, I too have some things to say about that. Mr. Speaker, when the lowest paid public sector workers in 2015 were granted an increase of $1,000 a week by our administration, the then opposition spokesperson finance described the increase as an insult. See it? Public sector increase, an insult. See it? See it? See it? Come on. Now that spokesman is Minister of Finance and is in a position to do better. But what has he done? What has he done? Mr. Speaker, the side man on the solid waste garbage truck earning $6,200 a week is being offered an increase of 5%, $310 a week. $310 a week. That's worse than insult. The JUTC driver earning $12,000 a week is being offered an increase of $600 a week. The lady who is an ancillary worker in a hospital or in a school earning $8,500 a week is being offered an increase of $425 a week. Mr. Speaker, where is the Shaw of 2015? I can't see him. I can't see him. sip of water. Mr. Speaker, at that time, the current minister said that $1,000 a week could only buy 2 chicken and 4 pounds of rice. Well, if that was the Shaw standard then, what can $600 or $425 or worse, $320 buy today? It can't even buy 1 maga chicken. Mr. Speaker, the public sector workers deserve better. The public sector workers deserve better. They were better off under our administration. We treated them with respect. We treated them with respect. We consulted them in a genuine way. We earned their trust. Yes. But now they are being insulted. The take it or leave it thing. In his budget presentation last Thursday, the minister tried to justify the proposed package for public sector workers of 16% over 4 years, which is below the government's own projected rate of inflation for that period. And he tried to justify it with some arithmetical gymnastics to make it look like they are getting much more than that. Mr. Minister, it was disingenuous to mention the standard annual 2.5% performance increment, which has been in place for many years as part of the pay package being offered to the public sector workers, as if that is anything new. The 2.5% performance increment has always been part of the public sector remuneration, and even when there was no increase on basic pay. And in fact, not everyone gets a performance increment, as the teachers, the police, and others have pointed out. Boy, Mr. Speaker, what gone bad a morning can't come good a evening, you know. We are seeing it now, you know. It started bad in 2016 and it can't come good a evening. Mr. Speaker, but what is even more harsh was the suggestion that public sector workers have seen an average increase in their net pay of between 7% and 14% because of the 1.5. Now, Mr. Speaker, I ask you, is that not hypocrisy in the extreme? How can you say to public sector workers in February 2016 that they would benefit from $18,000 a month of more pay because of your 1.5, and then you rely on the 1.5 as your justification for denying the public sector workers a reasonable increase that will be ahead of projected inflation? How can that be? What's worse, Mr. Speaker, you have already taken it back from them in the over 30 billion of taxes, indirect taxes, that you impose to pay for this 1.5. Minister, you give with one hand and then you turn around and shoot them with the other hand. That part of your plan was kept well hidden in February 2016. Well hidden. No one would have voted for that tax plan if they knew it would be used to deny them a reasonable pay increase after all the sacrifices they made to help put Jamaica's public finances on track. Mr. Speaker, that is Samfai governance. That is your way, not our way. And it is time to change your ways and do right by the Jamaican people and the country. Mr. Speaker, finally, the minister has indicated that retroactive payments for the fiscal year just ended from April 1 last year will be paid to all public sector workers, including the police and the teachers and others who have not reached an agreement with the government. How can this be? What is the legal basis for the government making this payment when there is no contractual arrangement in place to authorize it? These are public funds and must be used in accordance with the law, and not as a tool to undermine the sanctity of the collective bargaining process. That happens in dictatorships, Mr. Speaker. It should never happen in our democracy. Parliament in 1976. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable, Right Excellent, Alexander Bustamante, Hugh Lawson Shearer, Michael Joshua Manley, and Portia Lucretia Simpson Miller as trade unionists and past prime ministers would never condone this. Never. Not even those unions who have signed on for the paltry increase over the 4 years offered by your government can support such a violation. Mr. Speaker, we never operated in this way. It is a disgrace to see a government behaving like this towards its own employees. Minister, once again, I'm asking you, do what is right for the people and the country. Withdraw your position and go back to the bargaining table. Don't be wrong and strong. Mr. Speaker, as I come to the end of my first budget presentation, all good things must come to an end. All good things must come to an end. As I come to the end of my first budget presentation, my message is that Jamaicans, and indeed we in this House, are all in this thing together. We may disagree on some things, but there are many things on which we can all agree. We are all loyal Jamaicans, giving public service through political engagement because we love our country. Mr. Speaker, the people are Jamaica's most important asset. We must invest generously in our people to give them the ability to improve their lives. It is the duty of the government to create an enabling environment that supports self-reliance, entrepreneurship, wealth creation, and genuine prosperity that will benefit everyone. And we must invest in the people to achieve that. Our people deserve this and much, much more. Every Jamaican must feel that if they work hard, they will find success. Those are the only foundations on which we can build an equitable and just Jamaica and a place to live, work, raise families, and do business. Mr. Speaker, may God bless us all and bless our beautiful and sweet Jamaica, land we love.
Marcus. Yes, Marcus. Sorry.
Sister B, yes, sir. Money.
We are still in session. Order, please. Members in the gallery, keep quiet. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking for the... Mr. Speaker.
Members, we are still in session, please. Mr. Warmington.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask for the suspension of the debate on the estimates of expenditure for the year 2018, 2000. Suspension of the debate on the appropriation bill until Thursday, when leader opposition will speak. And at the same time, I'm asking for the recommittal of announcement.
Those in favor? Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Order, please. Mr. Daly.
Also laid on the table of the House today is Minister Paper number 22, entitled Establishment of the 2017-2021 Compensation Cycle and Payment of Increases in Compensation to Public Sector Workers within the fiscal year to which those increases relate, and the Financial Administration and Audit Compensation Negotiating Cycles Order 2018 under the Financial Administration and Audit Act.
Mr. Speaker, it's not intended to do any further business for the day. I ask for the House be adjourned until tomorrow at 2 p.m. Tomorrow, Wednesday, at 2 p.m. And the PAAC will meet tomorrow at 10.
The motion is that we adjourn until tomorrow, the 14th.
Mr. Speaker, please. No. Mr. Speaker, please. Mr. Speaker, please. I crave your indulgence on the motion of adjournment.
Mr. Speaker,
I crave your indulgence.
On a point of order.
This is
on a point of order. On a point of order. You can't raise that.
Mr. Speaker,
on a point of order,
Mr. Speaker, this is the national interest.
It's not permitted to get up like that. The Speaker
Mr.
must be advised.
This is in the national interest. I crave your indulgence. This is in the national. I could not have informed. No. I tell you something.
Mr. Daly, you're a senior member of this parliament. You are a senior member of this parliament. The Speaker is standing. Have a seat.
Why are you
when
standing?
you want to speak on a motion of adjournment, you advise the Speaker. I am speaking, Mr. Daly. Have a seat. I am speaking. Please have a seat. Mr. Daly, you're a senior member of this parliament. And I wish you to do better than that.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Daly,
never.
Mr. Daly,
yes.
Wait a minute, please.
Yes,
have
okay.
a seat. All of us inside here must recognize our responsibilities. Nobody is going to prevent you from speaking in this House while you follow the standing orders. Nobody on either side while I am Speaker of the House. But we are not going to get up in that kind of manner. That does not represent intelligence. There's a motion on the floor for adjournment. You did not consult me. 1 minute. But I'm going to ask you to now get up and address me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to clap. We need to clap for that.
Order,
Mr.
please.
Speaker, I am much obliged because I know that you are aware that if I had seen this before, I, as a trade unionist, senior member of the trade union movement in prior life, I would have slipped around, come to talk to you and the House leader about this piece of paper which was just laid to us. This is in the national interest. And it's a pity it is laid now after such a brilliant presentation by the opposition spokesman final. But I just got this, that the Minister of Finance has issued an order changing the negotiating cycle of the public sector workers to a 4-year cycle.
Unilaterally.
unilaterally changing it, even though he has the power under the Financial, Administrative and Audit Act. But you're going to change the cycle of negotiation while you have the police still negotiating. You have teachers still negotiating. You have nurses still negotiating. Doctors still negotiating. And you're going to change the cycle on the public sector workers like this. It is a shame on this administration. Shame. And I tell you today, Mr. Speaker, I say further, this will not be allowed to be passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to direct members to the Ministry paper number 2218, which gives a clearer explanation as to the purpose for this order. Mr. Speaker, it is well known and has been made clear by the government that we have put in place a negotiation cycle for 4 years. That is known. And I simply want to, Mr. Speaker, I simply want to quote from the Financial, Administration and Audit Act, 48H, subsection 1, reads, government policy with respect to the negotiation of rates of pay and related conditions of employment for persons employed to the government shall be consistent with the targets specified under Section 48C and the policies and plans set out in the Fiscal Management Strategy. 2. For the purposes of subsection 1, the minister responsible for the public service shall, by order, subject to negative resolution, establish compensation negotiating cycles that allow for compensation settlement for persons employed to the government to be incorporated into the estimates of expenditure for the financial year to which settlement relates. And so it should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that among the targets that Section 48C of the FAA Act speaks to is the attainment of a wage to gross domestic product of 9% or less by the end of financial year 2018-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that the House be now adjourned until 2 o'clock tomorrow. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This Honorable House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.
Crime Stop Jamaica presents CS311. Unsolved crimes, safety tips, did you know? Watch that scam, missing, most wanted. We give you the facts, the stats, everything you should know about the law, safety, and you. Brought to you in association with PBCJ and our sponsors, Musson Foundation, National Bakery, King Alarm, and Grace